Well, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I've done a couple of talks. I did one in Stonington. I've done one in Woodbury, Connecticut. I've been to Lebanon, Connecticut. Here I am in Groton. Thursday, I'm back in Stonington. So it seems like I've got this whirlwind tour that apparently is going to end abruptly after Thursday. So, anybody has any ideas of where I should go next? I'd like to get into New York if anybody has any context. Anyway, so here's my book. It's my first effort. Anne described it as my newest book. Well, it is my newest one, but it's my only one. The book has been out now about 5 months. See how quickly things happen here? Oh, geez. And I've received some very positive comments about the book, which is thrilling. As I hoped, I have received questions related to the content of the story, the fire department, and the time. I'll address a few of these, and I'll tell you a bit about the FDNY, the Fire Department of New York, and I'll give you a couple of snippets of the story. I'm going to move that because I want to block the view. So I'd like to start out with a shout out to a man who was not a firefighter, but rather a photographer. That's not him. What happened there? That man. That is Arthur Dreyfus. And he's wearing a New York City hat, but he was not a fireman. He was a lifetime New Yorker who spent 35 years from 1912 to 1947 chronicling the people and the major fires that occurred in the city, mostly in Manhattan. His collection is preserved by the Connecticut Firemen's Historical Society, an organization on whose board I serve. I'll show you only a few of Arthur's works, but they will add some depth and understanding to my story. So he was unofficial, and then he became the official photographer. But because my story takes place in 1904 to about 1906, even though he started taking photos in 1912, there's still, you know, a fire truck 8 years later or so is not that much different. They would be if we get into the motorized era, which started about that time also. So I give this man a lot of credit for what he did, and he certainly had fun doing it. But let's start with a question. If you were alive around the turn of the 20th century, and you were walking along a street somewhere in Manhattan, or in Boston, or Philadelphia, or New Haven, or Chicago, and you saw this coming toward you, this is the reference to this, would you stop and watch it go by? Well, what you're looking at is actually, that is Harlem, and that is engine 80, which I'm sure you don't care about. But you can see that it's a steam engine being pulled by 3 horses and the driver. And down in the lower right-hand corner, it says copyright A. Dreyfus. So that is one of Arthur's pictures. He made his photos look as best he could as a real, I'm going to a fire kind of scene. But that would be a stage shot. He would set up the camera in the street somewhere, and he knew the firemen and he knew the officers and so on, so he could get them to rush by for him and get a pretty darn good shot. And if you were a youngster, and I'm going to skip back to Arthur for a second here. How about this picture? If you were one of those kids that's running along there, I'll just zoom in on them quickly here. See these guys here? This is a stage shot too, I believe. But one thing that kind of makes you think, what is this fellow doing here on this running board, putting on his boot? That is a ladder company in New Haven. That's ladder 1. A lot of times you can identify things by simple, weird things like that one that's on the helmet there. So that's ladder 1, taken about 1892. That is one of the finest photos. But I think of myself as being that one of those young boys and that would have shaped my life for sure. So I've been collecting, personally, I've been collecting information about fire trucks from New York and Connecticut for years, but I never paid much attention to the apparatus that was drawn by horses. I believe that's because I didn't grow up with them. Still, I hadn't taken time to study the early history of firefighting. Did you know that for 50 years, that would be between 1865 and about 1911, horses have been used exclusively to pull all of the fire apparatus of the big city paid departments in the US and New York. That's a long time. I've always been attracted to a fire truck, but what about these beautiful animals pulling shiny steam engines and long aerial ladders? I'm quite sure I would have done the same thing as those boys and probably become a fireman at some point. So, thinking about the story, I thought, what would be the best way for me to go about learning more about the horses and the fire service at the turn of the century? I figured I could write about it. I'd pick a location, I'd pick a year, and I could develop a character. So the location was simple. For me, it had to be New York. I already had a lot of information about it. Lower Manhattan had a little bit of everything, including the greatest fire department in the world. And it still claims to be the greatest fire department in the world. The year was 1904, and it was 1904 really by, I just picked it. I just picked it. But I also knew that the motorized era was coming in New York, and 1909 was the first time they had an apparatus. It was a hose wagon that was self-propelled, but it really wasn't until 1911 and 1912 that the department became motorized. So I wanted to do something before that time. So I chose 1904, and then I needed a character who would fit in 1904. So I thought, well, if you're going to, as a writer, you have to have an audience, and logically you think that my audience for the book would be firefighters. But I also wanted my audience to be people who had no prior knowledge of the fire service. Some of you may be sitting here who have no prior knowledge of the fire service, other than it's out there. So it made sense to me that I'd create a character who didn't know anything either. Level the playing field between the character and the reader, in other words. So did I know anybody who lived back in 1904? Well, my grandfather, Frank Farley, was in New York around that time studying architecture at Columbia University. And he later worked in the city as an architect and raised his family there. When I knew him toward the end of his life, he was very interesting and full of knowledge. So I tried to imagine him as a 21-year-old, and I know he had a keen intellect from what I knew of him. He was well educated and he had insatiable curiosity. Great qualities for my character. I didn't like the name Frank particularly, so I chose Michael with the nickname Mickey. And I kept the idea of him attending college and studying architecture at Cooper Union, which is on 3rd Avenue between 7th and 8th Streets. So my grandfather didn't know anything about firefighting, as far as I know. He died in 1973. That was the first year I joined the fire department in Stonington Borough. So we had no overlap. It wasn't like I was telling him what was going on in the fire department. And as far as I know, he never mentioned the fire department. But the connections to my grandfather also extended to his family history and social standing. His mother's family was successful in the textile business and had money. Therefore, any interest that Mickey might have in a decidedly blue-collar profession of firefighting was a potential conflict. It really was not the plan, but not that I really had a plan when I started writing this, but I realized that I brought his social standing with him because I was thinking about him as a person. And so it helped to shape the story that I had. It wasn't just a fire story. There was going to be other things about living in New York, but the culture, and also about this. He's from a fairly wealthy family, and firemen are not, as a rule. So Mickey wasn't going to be your typical candidate for the job. From the start, my writing was a first-person story. Put the character right there, front and center, in the action all the time. The pressure would be on to make him believable and interesting. But beyond that, I had no outline of the story, I had no goal, and it had no end either. It was only a series of events based on the same question: what shall I write about next? It wasn't as simple as, oh, I'll write about a big fire. You know, something like that. That's another Arthur Dreyfuss picture. But I could write about something like that because I have seen a couple of times big fires, and I certainly have studied them. So I could use that experience that I've had for 50 years. But big or small, fires weren't fought the same way as they are today. And Manhattan wasn't the same as it is today. And a 21-year-old definitely didn't think and act the same as one does today. So just how did one become a fireman in the early 20th century, and what was firehouse life like? I didn't find any books or accounts that specifically addressed that. So I had some work to do. I've been asked, what's a really favorite part of my story? It shouldn't be possible to answer that question if you've written a good book. But anyway, as some background, here's a very crude map of Lower Manhattan where most of the story takes place. That's not that crude, but it's a little hard to see. So that's the island of Manhattan. Most of you are probably familiar with it, and there's Central Park in the central area. And this is, and it's color-coded because there are a lot of smaller maps, so it's the reference to it. But we are dealing with this part of Lower Manhattan. So we have the Battery down at the bottom, and Broadway runs up the center of it, and here is Washington Square. You see where it says Washington Square 4th in the center. So the area just to the south of that in 1904 was the cast iron district. And here it is here. Now this map is turned on a slight angle, but you see Washington Square again. So that green area there is what is called the dry goods district in 1904. Lots of 5, 6-story factory buildings in there. And it's just before they're going to start building a whole new bunch of buildings north of Washington Square up to about 23rd Street. So the whole textile industry is going to shift to the north because they're cramped in the buildings that they have. But that becomes the area that Mickey, my character, is going to spend quite a bit of time. So he lives, I'm not supposed to say anything if I don't have the microphone with me. He lives over here, and school is up that way. So in other words, he has to walk through that area every day to go to school. Along the way, I'm sorry to say, the building did not look like this in 1904. This is the Fireman's Hall. It was the headquarters of the volunteer fire department, whatever you want to call it, the headquarters, because that was one of the problems they had before the paid time, was there was no cohesive structure of the officers. But this was the Fireman's Hall. It's on Mercer Street. The building still exists, but they changed it a whole lot. This was, in the volunteer time, there was a hose company and a ladder company in there, and you can see there's a statue up on the, that was taken down, and they really changed the front of it, but I didn't have a photo of it from 1904. And So I would like to read a short piece here. Within this district is ladder 20. So Mickey will spend some time at ladder 20. And following a fire, he has an opportunity to visit the captain of the company and a firehouse for the first time. This is the way the firehouse looked in 1860, but I got to take you forward to 1904. So we said he's living on Sullivan Street, so he's leaving his apartment. The neighborhood was Sunday quiet, traffic limited to a few carriages and casual strollers along the 5-block stretch of Prince Street. I made the familiar turn onto Mercer Street and strode boldly to the firehouse's mid-block location. Up close, the broad ground-level cast-iron facade was imposing, much like a bank vault, in contrast to the soft brown sandstone above. A pair of tightly closed doors safeguarded each of the 2 square bay openings. A sudden chill of doubt coursed through my body. Was I ready for this? A glistening brass knocker on the narrow center door attracted my attention. It was like Aunt Polly's, a cheery invitation to enter her warm home. She'd answer, always smiling, always thrilled to see me. I held her in my thoughts, stepped up to the knocker, drew an anxious breath, and rapped 3 times. Almost at once, a middle-aged fireman in uniform and cap opened the door. He had a grizzled look, perhaps a veteran of many a fire. "Aye," he said without expectation. "I'm here to see the captain," I said, trying my best to seem official. "You don't know the man's name?" the fireman retorted curtly. His question unnerved me, the excitement of the moment suddenly draining away. "No, I don't. I met him the other day at the fire on Broome Street, and he invited me to visit. I never asked his name. I'm sorry, I should have." "Heavens, laddie, don't be alarmed. I'm just playing with you. I know who you are. Murray's been talking about you ever since. And I was there too. You can't remember a handsome face when you see one?" The man broke into a hearty laugh. I blushed with embarrassment and sighed with relief. Did he say they've been talking about me? "Come right in, young fella," he continued affably. "You come at a good time. We're done with the chores for a bit. My name's O'Boyle, by the way. Harry to you. I have house watch, and I must return to my post. Step inside." Tentatively, I entered onto the apparatus floor and stopped, awestruck. I will stop there. Maybe awestruck. So that piece was written well before I happened to find some photos from the Museum of the City of New York, and this is one of them. There is a picture taken inside the very same firehouse that I'm writing about. Now, granted, I was able to add a few details that I didn't have before, but otherwise I was just imagining what it was like to be going into a firehouse. So you are not looking at a fire scene, but you can see there's a fellow in the back there. He's on a fire pole. And the driver is, this is the head of the driver right here. You can see my mouse moving. So he's getting up in the seat. The ladder truck stretches to the left and back. There are horse stalls on either side of the truck. 2 of the horses have come from the far side and are near the yoke, and the 3rd horse is in the left of the picture, and he's going to be stepping forward. It's almost like this fellow in the front here is waving the horse to his position. And to the back right is this area is the house watch desk. So you would have watch much like you would on a ship, normally for 4 hours, and when the bells came in, you'd have to alert the firemen if they didn't already hear it. So there we are inside truck 20, as it says, 20 truck or truck 20. The ladders were referred to as truck companies and still are today. Here's another photo of the same watch desk, not quite maybe at the same time. But there are bells and there's a telephone, which O'Boyle doesn't like. In the upper left-hand corner, there's the alarm sheet so the firemen know where the boxes are ringing in from. There's a railing around the area. There's a radiator that's very close by, which must be appreciated in the wintertime. So that's kind of that's always up near the front of the firehouse. Here's a picture taken outside of the ladder truck. So it's sticking back into the bay, but they've got 3 horses. Again, truck 20, 08 would be 1908. So there was a chief that, he was of the 3rd Battalion, who was in that firehouse, and he was the first chief to respond to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911. I think some of these photos were taken for him. There's a picture of him in his office also. You can see the firemen standing in their uniforms. On the left-hand side, you've got the driver up on top, and you have the officer, whether it's the captain or the lieutenant, he's standing up on the turntable with him. Pretty cool, huh? This is a different firehouse. Mickey will spend time here too. This is engine 55, which is on Broome Street, which with that rectangle that you saw would be in the lower right-hand corner of it. This firehouse is in operation today. It's not one of the oldest ones. It was built in 1899, and I had the great fortune to be able to go into the firehouse and have lunch with the firemen and this Lieutenant Jeff Frohmeyer, who showed me all around the building. So for Mickey, who was going to spend time here, that was extremely helpful. There's a close-up of their door. You don't see a lot of firehouses like that. There's no firehouse in New York that's adorned like that with those oval windows, and that banner is probably not original, but that photo was taken in 1899, the day the firehouse opened, June 1st of 1899. So that's their steamer. They've got 3 horses. Certainly that was a posed shot. So that's the Broome Street Firehouse. Here's some of the interior shots. The fire truck would be on the left. They had gone out on a call, leaving me behind. And so I took advantage and took some photos. That's the staircase. So he is going to work in this firehouse. It's an unusual building, very narrow doorway. This is their house watch, more modern. It's been enclosed to keep it warm. And then, of course, the stairs go upstairs. There's no spiral staircase in this building. There's a fire pole. There are 4 fire poles, but that was the only one that goes. There are 2 that go down to the ground floor now. Most of the houses have tile like this, but not a ceiling like that also. Usually a tin ceiling that they leave in place because it's so dirty above it. This is Lieutenant Frohmeyer and me when I went down, and I gave him a book. That's Engine 55. It is in Little Italy. That's why they have the green and white and red colors. So does Mickey want to be a fireman in the story, or does he want to be just a fire buff? This is a dilemma that he faces, and a lot of us face it. Are we buffs, which means we want to go to the fires, but we're not actually fighting them, or do we want to be a fireman? So what is a fire buff? In 1915, in February 28, 1915, the New York Times had an article about fire buffs. And this is it. The Ancient Order of Buffs Incorporated. Well-to-do men who run to all the big fires with boyish enthusiasm is the headline. Now you see this photo here, this one here. Guess who took that picture? Arthur Dreyfus. That's the same picture. So he's only 3 years into his firefighting, but they used that picture. Nobody seems to be paying attention to him, but according to the New York Times article, a fire buff is a man mentally normal in every other way who would rather go to a fire at any hour of the day or night than do anything else in the world. It may occur to some people that buffs are more or less of a nuisance at a fire and accomplish no good, but the officials and firemen do not think so. Buffs are ever ready to perform any service that is required. Many have a thorough knowledge of firefighting methods. A buff is never so happy as when he is running an errand for the chief. And in the book, Mickey does just that and more. So you were looking at that order of buffs only had 12 members. Talk about exclusive. And Arthur Dreyfus was not one of them. He couldn't get in. He joined the Fire Bell Club as a buffs group that I'm a member of. He joined that one later on. But the fellow in the front is definitely a buff. And this guy here who has a badge on, that's how you could get inside the fire line, would be to wear a badge, and then the police wouldn't bother you because you had permission to do that. The other people are probably not. Maybe this fellow back here or this one, so maybe there's 4 of them in this picture. But I just wanted to straighten you out about fire buffs and firemen because it is an issue for Mickey. So Mickey has become a fire buff of sorts early in the story, but catching a big fire can be frustrating for a number of reasons. So I'll read another short piece for you, because we buffs who will sit around and listen to the radio waiting for a fire are often disappointed. This is Mickey saying, "My presence at the firehouse seemed to be a curse, for alarms, that is. Whenever the bells rang, it was for a box located outside Ladder 20's response area. I wanted to experience some action, anything. This was supposed to be a busy company. But today when I arrived, the first section was nowhere to be seen. There were 2 ladder trucks in that house." So he's referring to the first section that would go out first. "They went out about 20 minutes ago to box 268. You better hurry," Fritz, the watchman, said, getting me excited. That was 4th and Bowery, the location of the box, 4th and Bowery, in front of Cooper Union. Was my alma mater on fire? I dashed out with saying another word, wishing that I were wearing my running shoes. I ran along Bleecker, but it was a poor choice as delivery wagons blocked sidewalks and laborers ignored my pleas to step aside for me. I finally made it to Bowery and turned north, anticipating a column of smoke and a crowd of onlookers, but instead, a ladder truck was coming toward me, 3 white horses abreast, unhurried. I stopped on the sidewalk and watched them pass. Thank you, Arthur. Murray is the captain. Murray was standing up on the turntable. Keeney was driving the team at a slow trot. Sullivan was high above in the rear, steering the trailer, and 4 more men rode the running board. I know you're probably counting there, and actually there are 4. Total luck. But no one acknowledged me or even looked my way. I felt detached from them, from the entire company. I walked slowly back the same way I had come, my enthusiasm sapped. I had missed the action. Then I realized I was feeling sorry for myself. Over what? A false alarm? Why would firemen returning from an alarm expect me to be waving to them from the curb on one of the worst streets anywhere in Manhattan? It was a good thing that Murray hadn't seen me. What a stupid mistake I had made in allowing my exuberance to take over. I rounded the corner at Mercer Street and stopped. Perhaps I should just continue home. But with trepidation, I approached. The truck was parked past the firehouse and Keeney was tending to the hitched horses. The empty truck bay was being swept by several men, and only a moment more passed before Sullivan and several others come out. "Hey, Farley," Sullivan asked, "what are you doing standing way over there?" So none of them had seen me after all. I felt so foolish. But my enthusiasm had returned. So he's trying to learn his way around the fire department, and he does pretty well there, but you'll find out he has some issues with it also. So on a different subject, I asked some friends of mine for feedback as I was writing the story. Early on, I sent a chapter to a firefighter friend to get his opinion. He sent some comments back, but he also sent the chapter to a writer friend of his who very nicely sent me a reply along with some very good writing tips. She cautioned me not to write a narrative. Don't spend a lot of time telling the reader about something, show them through actions. I took that advice by creating a variety of knowledgeable characters and employed a lot of dialogue to convey information from which Mickey could learn. The more he learned, the more the reader would learn, and so would I in the process. So we go next to this. So this occurs in the story. He is going to become a fireman, and he's going to go to the School of Instruction, which is up on East 67th Street. And in the rear yard of the firehouse, there is the school and its drill yard. And what you're looking at is some men, they're standing on a net. There's some men below that, down at the bottom of the screen. It's like a 4-story building. And these men are scaling this building on scaling ladders. So these ladders are like 14 feet tall, so they would fit in here. I could stand up one. And I had thought of getting one at the Fire Museum, but the thought of actually transporting this scaling ladder and then bringing it in, and the talk I did in Woodbury was like a 9-foot ceiling, so it would have been problematic. But these people are doing their training, and they're climbing up. So I tell about that, but I tell about it rather than just that narrative. I have him telling his friend Billy about that, and they're sitting in a restaurant, and so he's describing the experiences that he has. This is an Arthur Dreyfuss picture, but the next picture is really even more interesting because that's the same drill yard, and it's 1935, moved up to 1935, but it's still the same things are happening. You can see over here, men on the scaling ladders, and some sort of a contraption they have here where they put these ladders together with this fellow standing up here and is tied this together. I think that's more for, I've never seen a setup like that at a fire, but they're doing dead man carries there on a ladder truck, which is a little bit more modern. Obviously a stage shot, but this is what they would do day after day for about 3 weeks. And what was really cool for me was I saw down at the bottom here, it says Firemen in the Making, and I said, great title for a book. Because I was struggling with that. I had a desire to serve. It didn't say anything about firemen. So I knew I had to get the word fireman, and that turned out to be the title for the book. So some interesting research came from all of this, as you can imagine. It is a lot to this. I didn't do the research overnight, but the manned library is in New York at the training center for the fire department on Randall's Island. So, and they have these reports. This one is the year 1904. All sorts of great things listed in there, like all the officers and the promotions and the notable fires and the deaths and all the arson investigations, all the apparatus is listed. Really meaty stuff for weirdos like me, who I can take that information and translate it for you. But I decided early on that I wasn't going to write chapter after chapter about the brave exploits of firemen, for that really only happened to a few firemen of the many employed in the profession. Was firefighting thrilling? For some, yes. But for many others, it was just a job. It was performed because it offered a salary, a paycheck every week, security. Entry-level pay for a fireman in 1904 was $800. It served a purpose to feed the family and not so much to entertain or glorify the individual. And plus, they got a 50% pension after 20 years of service and a $1,000 payout to the spouse at the husband's death. That was lucrative also. So it was fair compensation for a dangerous job, more dangerous than it is today. It just didn't have any of the protection that we have today. And these become important elements of the story. So how much was $800 in 1904? Another source is a book entitled Wage Earners' Budgets, a study of standards and cost of living in New York City. That sounds good, doesn't it? It really is. It really is a very good book. It was published in 1907, but the data comes from 1904. Families living in Greenwich Village, like 70 families. And a couple of key components about that. Number one, people, the families, they weren't run by the wife, but they were managed by the wife. So all the money that came in, whether there were kids working or the husband was working, she would take the money and she'd keep track of all of her expenses as well as all of her income, and she would parse out the money to, the husband might get an allowance. All right, here's your beer money. But they had their expenses, you know, you had food and you had heat and you had electricity and you had, they didn't have medical payments in those days, but surprisingly they had insurance. And life insurance was critical for them to the point that they would forego paying their rent so that they could pay for their insurance. Now these are like benevolent associations, whether it's the Metropolitan Life as a life insurance company or organizations that they would join in New York. And it's not like these people were coming and knocking on their doors and giving them money. It was important for them to make that $2 payment a week or $1 payment a week or whatever it was, because the husband, the man of the family, did not want to die a commoner. He wanted to have a place to be buried. He wanted dignity when he died. So because of that, you could see all of that. You could see how people were living and how much that, those reports then said, this is how much people are making. And $800 was about average. $600 was on the low end. $1,500 was on the high end. So very, very useful though for, you know, when Mickey gets an apartment with Billy, well, how much is he supposed to spend on an apartment? You don't just make up a number like that. Oh, I guess it'd be $150. Well, it's like $22 for a month for a place. Another terrific resource was the Sanborn maps. Now, this is another thing. These kind of things I just love. So you're looking at just a grid of Little Italy in 1905, because they made a whole set of maps in 1905. These were made for the insurance companies, so they give you all sorts of details about the buildings. And coloring, the pink is brick buildings, and the yellow is wooden buildings. So you can see almost all of the buildings were pink then. Mott Street on the right, Mulberry, Baxter, Hester Street, Grand Street. If you've been down to Little Italy, Chinatown, those probably sound familiar to you. But we'll zoom in over here to Mott Street, and we'll go to up here on this block here. So Mott Street is there on the right where it just says street, and then in the middle this is Mulberry Street. I won't bore you with a lot of details, but it does tell you the height of every building, the dimensions of every building, the address. This building, for example, has the X through it, is a stable. Why they put X's there, but there were quite a few of them. They always seem to put Chinese laundries in. But we'll look at 131, which I'm zooming in on the right side there. That's 131 Mott Street. The building says SD, so it's a store on the first floor, and there's a dwelling above for the other 4 floors, jam-packed with people. And then there's an open space, and then there's another one that says D4 right here. So this is the front tenement, and that's the rear tenement, D4. The rear tenements were not there to begin with. When they first built those buildings in the 1850s and 1860s, there were no rear tenements. They put them in because there were so many immigrants coming into the country, they didn't have any place to put them. So the landlords started building these buildings in the back, and believe me, they did not build them nicely. They did not build them, many of them did not have heat or running water. The latrines were outside, and you can see there's hardly even any access. There's a dotted line that runs through this building here. That dotted line, there's a little tunnel that you can go through on the first floor to get to the rear. Everyone in that building is Italian in 1900, actually, and had been born in Italy, except the youngest. The 2 buildings had a total of 104 people living in them. The block had a total of 1,294 people. And the block to the south had 1,379 inhabitants, all Italian, every single one of them. How do I know? Because I found the 1900 census, and I was able to count everybody. There were 50 people on a page, and you can see here in the middle, that says Italy, Italy, Italy. So the parents are born in Italy. The person that they're tracking is born in Italy. Everybody was Italian. So that's the area that Engine 55 is at. That's the area that Mickey is in. But what about the firemen? The firemen are exclusively Northern European, English, Irish, Germans. And I found one instance of an Italian listed in 1904 in the entire fire department that was Italian. So I don't know if that was the only person. You can't always tell by, the last name, but back then it was a pretty good clue. So here is a picture of Mott Street about 1900, and I don't think every street looked like that every day, but that's where the markets were, obviously in the summertime. Just teeming with people. And of course, in my fire department mentality, I'm thinking, how do you get a steam engine and a hose wagon down that street if you got to go to a call? So, people are scattering, but you can see they have lots of wagons, and we take advantage of those particular scenes. Like many professions, firefighting is complex. As a result, there was plenty to write about. Here are a few situations that Mickey and you may experience as you read the book and as I wrap up my talk. Well, we saw a ladder truck before, but I got to put another one in, another Arthur Dreyfuss picture. The team of horses, you wanted to try and get the colors to match. So if they were all brown or they were all white, that was good. If you mixed them, that was not so good. You got the tiller man up in the back there, steering the rear, fireman hanging on, and this one has a dog there. That's pretty cool. So from what I know, the dogs, what they were doing was warding off other wild dogs. They would go after them in that situation. So they were protecting the horses. This goes back to ladder 20 for a minute, but and it's the battalion chief's buggy. But what I find most important about this picture is the door knocker. Well, there was a door knocker on the door. There really was a door knocker on the door when Mickey goes there. You can see that the doors are different. I talked about the vault-like appearance to it. And a lot of these windows that have this grid like this, they still have firehouses that employ that pattern. This is the chief of the department. You might find that Mickey can meet some of the chiefs. I don't know what this guy was like so much. I think he was kind of pompous. He was a good leader. He was popular. This is Chief Croker. But I'd love to know what he had in his office besides what you can see there. This picture is kind of interesting here. It's about life nets. And there is a life net that's there. And I'm a little skeptical of that life net. It's not like one of those big canvas things that's going to hold you up. So, and this is at an engine company. This is Engine 18 in West Village. So there's a big question about where they even got the life net, because the engine company guys typically don't carry them. But there is the man on the ledge. And I will tell you a true story, because I went down the same day that I went to see Lieutenant Frohmeyer and give him the book, and I stopped at Engine 18. And of course, as a buff, what normally happens is you go to a firehouse in New York and the door is closed. So you can't tell anything. You don't know whether they're there or not. So I stood, I waited around. But as a buff, I could hear the truck coming. And there it was, coming down West 10th Street, so now I was in good shape. So the truck comes in, the door opens, the truck backs in, the firemen get off the truck. I'm standing there with my backpack, and right there out on the right side, because it's the same firehouse as it was then, and a couple of guys come over to me, and I tell them, yeah, you know, I've written this book about this fellow, and one person seemed interested, and the other fellow wasn't that interested. But so I said to the other fellow, I have seen a picture of Engine 18. Do you guys have any photos of Engine 18 in your firehouse? Oh yeah, we do, upstairs, he said. I said, do you happen to have one of somebody standing on a second floor ledge above a life net? He says, yep, we got that one, it's framed. I said, oh, did the guy jump? And he didn't bat an eyelash. He says, of course he did. So, I'm not convinced. I don't know. How many of you think he jumped into the life net? How many of you think he didn't jump into the life net? How many don't care? Okay, that's where we might be. Basement fires. These are the worst kinds of fires. No breathing apparatus. Really, we could almost say no common sense to go into something like this, but they did, because you had to get to the seat of the fire to get it. That would be that's not a drill, that's a real fire. Arthur Dreyfus takes this picture. There's a ladder that's set up there that goes down a level, and down they are in the basement there, and I'm sure there's not much ventilation. Here's another picture, maybe a different one. Strikes me that that's the chief, that's the battalion chief that's coming out of that basement. So what's he doing down there? And this is sometimes the result of what happens when you go down in the basement. They would be overcome by smoke, which was clean in one way, that was a lot of wood burning, but the chemicals in those days were they didn't know much about them at all. So they'd be overcome, and they would sit there, and most of the time they would just let the fresh air clear them up, and many of them would go back to work, but sometimes they would go to the hospital. But oxygen tents and therapy, that did not exist. This is a picture of a steamer operating at a fire. Clouds of smoke, of course, and at a big fire, they would burn tons and tons and tons of coal, as well as probably losing the building at the same time. Another picture. This one's kind of cool, because a lot of times they detach the horses from the steamer, but the horses, those are the rumps of the horses there in front. So the horses are still attached to this. Whatever might be going on, the crowd is pretty close to that call there. And if it was anything major, the police would come in force and move people out of the way. Here's another picture of a big fire. That's a water tower that's set up. And that's, for the most part, that's how they had to fight those fires, was that way, exterior attack. Here's another picture, a little bit more modern. The trucks are more modern. The work, the way it's done is still the same. And there's me. Now, I've learned a lot of things from this. Of course, I didn't have those pictures, but as a 12-year-old, that was fun. My brother was not very nice about it, though, because you can see it's got a little fire hydrant there in the lower right-hand corner. You hook it up to the garden hose. So all of that stuff had to be done. I would make the box, fill it with newspaper, park the trucks in the little firehouse in the backyard, and you'd have to drive out, hook up the hydrant, and then turn the water on, and then try to put the fire out. Well, my brother, I can remember him distinctly, whether it was this time or not, he would be blowing on the newspaper, and I think I was actually upset at him. Hey, you can't do that. You know, hey, I'm trying to put this fire out. So anyway, I've learned, you can see I've learned a lot through the years. But that is my talk, and I'd like to thank you.